From Outlaw to Love, the cowboy who called her his answered prayer, Willow Creek story. Caleb had always lived on the run. For years he had been an outlaw, riding from town to town, always looking over his shoulder. He had learned to trust no one, never letting anyone get too close. He knew too well that the life he had chosen would eventually catch up to him, but he never imagined it would feel this exhausting. The long days of running and hiding had left him weary, both in body and spirit. As Caleb rode into the small town of Willow Creek, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. He had no real plan, just the hope of finding a place where he could rest for a few days. The storm clouds that had been gathering in the distance now loomed overhead, signaling that rain was on the way. He needed shelter, and fast. He spotted a small cabin on the outskirts of town, nestled against the edge of a dense forest. It was a simple structure, with a thatched roof and wooden walls that seemed to blend into the landscape. Caleb didn't think twice. He guided his horse toward the cabin, hoping that whoever lived there wouldn't ask too many questions. As he approached, he saw a woman standing outside, holding a basket filled with herbs and flowers. Her face was turned toward the sky, and her long brown hair fluttered in the breeze. Caleb hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. He had been around people long enough to know that they usually kept their distance from strangers, especially outlaws like him, but something about her presence calmed him. She didn't seem afraid or wary. She simply watched the storm roll in, as if she had all the time in the world. "Ma'am?" Caleb called out, his voice rough from days of travel. The woman turned to face him, her eyes bright and curious. She studied him for a moment, and Caleb could tell that she was trying to make sense of him. He had expected fear, or at least some hesitation, but instead, she smiled gently. "You look like you could use some shelter from the storm," she said, her voice soft but steady. Caleb nodded. "I'd appreciate that, ma'am." She simply motioned for him to follow her inside. Caleb dismounted and led his horse to the small barn next to the cabin before stepping inside. The cabin was cozy, with a crackling fire in the hearth. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. Caleb's stomach growled at the smell, and he felt a pang of hunger he hadn't noticed before. The woman smiled again and gestured for him to sit at the table. "I'm Emily," she said, pulling a chair out and sitting across from him. "I don't usually have visitors out here. Are you from Willow Creek?" "No," Caleb replied, his gaze flickering toward the window. "Just passing through." Emily didn't press him for more details. She simply served him a bowl of warm stew and fresh bread. Caleb ate in silence, savoring the food. It had been a long time since he had had a proper meal, and it felt like a gift from heaven. As he finished, Emily spoke again. "You must be tired. Feel free to rest here for the night." "I don't mind." Caleb looked at her, surprised by her kindness. Most people would have turned him away, especially if they knew the kind of man he used to be, but Emily didn't seem afraid. She treated him like a neighbor, not a criminal. It was a feeling Caleb wasn't used to, and it made him uncomfortable. "I don't want to cause you any trouble," he said, his voice low. "I can sleep in the barn if that's better." "You're welcome here. I'm not afraid of you." Caleb's heart twisted at her words. He had grown used to people fearing him, running from him the moment they learned of his past. But Emily wasn't like that. She saw him as a man in need, not as an outlaw or a criminal. And in that moment, Caleb realized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'm not used to kindness. I believe in offering kindness to those who need it. Everyone deserves a chance to find peace." As the storm raged outside, Caleb lay down by the fire, staring into the flames. The crackling of the wood was the only sound in the cabin, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb allowed himself to relax. The weight of his past was still heavy on his shoulders, but for that night, he was just a man, no longer an outlaw. The morning after the storm had passed, Caleb woke up to the soft light of dawn spilling through the window. He stretched his sore muscles and rubbed his face. The events of the previous day felt like a dream. The storm had brought him here, to this peaceful cabin, and Emily had offered him kindness without question. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. He hadn't known how badly he needed it until now. He heard the sound of Emily moving about the cabin, preparing breakfast. The smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. Caleb stood and walked over to the small table where she had already set a plate of food for him. "Good morning, Emily," said with a bright smile, her voice warm and welcoming. "Morning," Caleb replied, his voice a little rougher than usual. He took a seat at the table and picked up his fork. He had no idea how long he had been living in a state of constant tension, but for a moment it was easy to forget his past, to forget who he was. As he ate, Caleb noticed that Emily seemed at ease, unaffected by his presence. She wasn't afraid or distant like others might have been. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet strength, as though she had seen hardship but had learned to rise above it. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to Willow Creek, to this secluded cabin. Her kindness seemed out of place in a world that often rewarded cruelty and distrust. "I don't mean to pry," Caleb said, breaking the silence, "but what brings you out here? Away from the town?" Emily paused, as if weighing whether to share her story, but then she smiled softly, as if deciding that there was no harm in it. "I came here to find peace," she said quietly. "Life in the city was too much for me. I needed a place where I could think, where I could be alone with my thoughts. Willow Creek seemed like the perfect place." He understood that feeling. For years he had run from the noise, the violence, the guilt that chased him everywhere. But unlike Emily, he hadn't found peace. He had only found more trouble, more mistakes. As the day passed, Caleb grew more restless. He couldn't stay here forever. Sooner or later, his past would catch up to him, just as it always had. He couldn't keep hiding, and he couldn't risk bringing harm to Emily. But when he tried to leave that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Emily stopped him at the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concern. "I can't stay here," Caleb said, his voice tense. "You've been kind enough already. I don't want to bring trouble to your doorstep." "You're not bringing trouble," Emily said firmly. "You don't have to leave." Caleb shook his head, but Emily stepped closer, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You've helped me more than you know," she said softly. "I believe in second chances. I believe that people can change if they want to." Her words hit Caleb like a wave crashing over him. He had spent so long believing that he couldn't change, that his past would always define him. But here was Emily, someone who saw him for who he could be, not who he had been. "I'm not a good man," Caleb muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've done things, terrible things." Emily's eyes softened. She placed a hand on his arm, a simple gesture, but it made Caleb feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. "You don't have to be defined by your past," she said quietly. "You can choose who you want to be now." Caleb's heart clenched at her words. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that he could change, that he could find redemption. But the ghosts of his past haunted him, whispering that it was impossible. The sound of hooves approaching the cabin broke his thoughts. Caleb's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. Emily looked at him, her expression confused. "Stay inside," Caleb said quickly, his voice low. "It could be trouble." He stepped outside, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He didn't know who was coming, but he knew better than to take any chances. As he walked toward the front of the cabin, his eyes scanned the area, looking for any signs of danger. It wasn't long before he saw them. 2 riders, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats. They weren't from Willow Creek. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. "Are you Caleb Hayes?" one of the men called out, his voice cold. Caleb's hand clenched around the handle of his knife. "What do you want?" The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he and his companion dismounted and walked closer. The tension in the air was thick. "We've been looking for you," the man said. "Thought you might be hiding out here. You owe some people a debt." Caleb's blood ran cold. His past had finally caught up to him. The gang he had once ridden with had come to collect what they thought was owed to them. "I don't have anything for you," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. The 2 men exchanged glances. One of them reached for his gun, but Caleb was faster. In a flash, his knife was in his hand, ready to defend himself. He knew he couldn't fight them both, but he wasn't going down without a fight. Just as the standoff seemed ready to explode, Emily appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her eyes wide with concern. "Caleb!" she called, her voice filled with panic. "Stay inside," Caleb ordered, his gaze never leaving the men. The 2 riders looked at each other, then back at Caleb. They didn't want trouble with a woman, especially one who was clearly frightened. After a long moment, the man who had spoken first let out a heavy sigh. "This isn't over," he said, his tone cold. "We'll be back for what's owed." Without another word, they mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing into the distance. Caleb stood there, his heart racing, his breath shallow. As the sound of the horses faded away, Emily stepped out from the cabin, her eyes still wide with fear. "Who were they?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They're part of my past," Caleb said, his voice grim. And it's not over. I have to deal with them. Emily's face softened with understanding. You don't have to face this alone. Caleb didn't know what to say. Her kindness was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. The day after the encounter with the two riders, Caleb woke up early, the weight of what was coming pressing down on him. The sun hadn't risen yet, but he was already up, his mind restless. He had no choice now. His past had caught up with him, and there was no way to escape it. He looked over at Emily, still asleep in the small bedroom of the cabin. Her peaceful face, with the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, made his heart ache. She had shown him nothing but kindness since he arrived, but now she was caught in his mess. He couldn't let anything happen to her. He would leave. He had to. But as Caleb prepared to sneak away, his heart battled against his mind. It wasn't just about running anymore. Emily had changed something inside of him. She had shown him a kindness he hadn't earned, and in return, he had started to feel like he could be more than just the outlaw he had always been. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of redemption. He sighed deeply, resting his hand on the doorframe. He didn't want to leave her, but he couldn't bring danger to her doorstep. Suddenly, Emily stirred behind him. Caleb? Her voice was soft but firm, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. He turned to find her sitting up in bed, her hair messy from sleep, but her eyes clear and awake. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't upset. She simply looked at him with a quiet understanding that made his chest tighten. You don't have to leave, she said gently. I can't put you in danger, Caleb said, his voice rough with the weight of his words. I'm not the man you think I am. My past, his voice trailed off. How could he explain all the things he had done? How could he explain the parts of him that were broken beyond repair? I already know who you are, Caleb, Emily replied, her voice calm but full of conviction. I don't need to know everything. What I know is that you've come here seeking peace. You're not who you were, and I believe that. It wasn't the first time someone had said that. But with Emily, it felt different. He had spent years running from who he was, hiding from his past, but she saw him for who he could be. I don't deserve your kindness, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've hurt people, Emily. People I can never make right. Emily stood up, walking toward him. She didn't look afraid, despite the danger they were facing. Instead, her expression was full of strength. You don't have to make everything right on your own, she said, her hand resting on his arm. You can choose to be different now. That's all anyone can do. The words hit Caleb like a storm. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that he could change, that he could leave his past behind. But every time he tried to move forward, the weight of his mistakes held him back. Emily's hand gently squeezed his arm, breaking through his thoughts. You don't have to face this alone. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Caleb looked down at her, his heart full of gratitude and pain. He had never wanted to drag anyone into his mess. He had never wanted to put anyone in danger, but Emily was offering him something that scared him more than anything, the chance to change. Before Caleb could respond, the sound of hooves reached his ears. His stomach tightened. The outlaws had returned. This time it was no longer a warning. It was the moment Caleb had been dreading. He knew what he had to do. Stay inside, he said firmly, moving toward the door. But Emily caught his arm. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice steady, eyes full of resolve. You don't have to face them alone. Caleb looked at her, a wave of emotion flooding through him. He had never met anyone like her. Brave, kind, unafraid. But this wasn't just about him anymore. He couldn't let her face this danger, no matter how strong she was. Emily, please, he said, his voice strained. I can't. You're not the only one who gets to make decisions here, she interrupted gently. I want to help you, Caleb, and I'm not afraid of whatever comes. We're in this together. The words wouldn't come, but his heart was pounding in his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt like someone truly saw him, not the outlaw, not the criminal, but the man he could be. And he wasn't ready to lose that, not without a fight. The door creaked open as the riders approached. Caleb turned to face the inevitable, but Emily stayed by his side. They were in this together. As the two riders came into view, Caleb stepped out onto the porch. The tension in the air was thick, and his hand instinctively went to his belt, where his gun hung low. He wasn't going to fight for his life alone. Not anymore. Caleb Hayes, the leader of the group, said with a sneer, dismounting. You're coming with us. You've made a mess of things, and now you've got to answer for it. Caleb stood tall, his heart racing but his mind clear. This wasn't the man he had been. This wasn't the outlaw he had been running from for all these years. "I'm not going anywhere," Caleb said, his voice steady. The leader laughed. "You think you can stand against us?" Before Caleb could respond, Emily stepped forward, standing beside him. Her face was calm, but there was strength in her eyes that Caleb had never seen before. "We're not afraid of you," Emily said, her voice unwavering. "You don't scare us." The leader narrowed his eyes, glancing between Caleb and Emily. For a moment, the standoff seemed to stretch on forever, the weight of the past heavy in the air. But then, something changed. Caleb's eyes locked with the leader's, and for the first time in a long time he felt a spark of confidence. "You'll never get what you want," Caleb said. "Not from me, not from anyone who's ready to stand up." The leader hesitated. It was clear he hadn't expected this kind of resistance. "You've made a mistake, Caleb," the leader muttered. "You've got nowhere to run." "I'm not running anymore," Caleb replied, his voice firm, "and I won't be your pawn." Then, without another word, the two riders turned and walked back to their horses. Caleb didn't lower his guard until they had ridden off into the distance, disappearing into the horizon. Caleb stood there, his heart pounding, his hand still on his gun. But Emily was beside him, her presence a quiet strength. "You don't have to fight this battle alone anymore," Emily said softly. "I'm with you, Caleb, always." Caleb turned to her, his heart full of gratitude. For the first time in years, he believed that he could have a future. He could change. And Emily was the reason why. The days that followed the riders' departure were quieter, but the air around the cabin still felt charged with tension. Caleb couldn't help but wonder if they would come back, if the trouble he had once caused would return to Willow Creek, but Emily's presence was a constant reminder that he didn't have to face this alone. He wasn't just running anymore. He had someone who believed in him. Each day, as he worked beside her to repair the cabin and tend to the land, Caleb found himself opening up more. He told Emily stories of his past, of the mistakes he had made, the people he had hurt. It wasn't easy. Some of those memories were painful to relive. But with Emily, there was no judgment, no fear. She listened with kindness and understanding, never turning away, never making him feel small. It was on one of these quiet afternoons that Caleb found himself on the porch watching the sun dip low in the sky. Emily had gone to gather firewood, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The memories of his outlaw days seemed distant now, like a life that didn't belong to him, but they still lingered, and he knew he had to make peace with them if he ever wanted to truly move forward. He heard the sound of hooves approaching, a sound that made his heart race. His first instinct was to reach for his gun, but he stopped himself. This wasn't like the riders who had come before. This time, he was different. He stood up, his legs stiff from the hours of work, and walked to the edge of the porch. His eyes narrowed as he saw two figures approaching on horseback. It wasn't the riders from before, but strangers nonetheless. Caleb's hand went to the buckle of his belt, but Emily appeared beside him, calm as always. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice low. "I don't know," Caleb replied, his eyes scanning the men. "But we'll find out soon enough." The riders stopped just a few feet from the porch. The taller of the two men dismounted and looked Caleb over, his gaze sharp and calculating. The other man remained on horseback, watching closely. "You Caleb Hayes?" the taller man asked, his voice gruff. Caleb nodded, his posture relaxed but alert. "I am. Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Caleb for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he spoke again. "We've been sent by the sheriff in Willow Creek," the man said. "We've heard about your run-ins with some of the wrong people, and we think it's time we had a talk." A quiet wave of relief washed over Caleb. He hadn't expected it to be the law, but he knew the sheriff had been keeping an eye on him ever since he'd arrived in Willow Creek. He was no fool. He knew his past wasn't something he could outrun forever. But for the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel like a man on the edge of the law. He felt like a man with something to prove. "I've got nothing to hide," Caleb said, his voice steady. "What do you need to talk about?" The man nodded and gestured for his companion to stay put while he walked closer. "We've heard you've been getting into trouble with some outlaws," he said. "They're looking for you, Caleb. They want you back." Caleb's heart sank. His past was coming to collect, but this time it was different. He wasn't alone. Emily was standing beside him, her quiet strength reminding him of why he had come this far. "I'm not going back to that life," Caleb said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "I've made my choice. I'm not who I was." "I believe you," he said after a long moment. "But there's still the matter of the law." You've broken enough rules in the past that we can't just let it slide. The sheriff wants you to come to town and answer for what you've done." Emily stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. Caleb's heart swelled at the sight of her. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't backed down. She was standing by him, as she always had. "You don't need to do this alone," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Caleb is a different man now. He's earned the right to be free." The sheriff's man seemed taken aback by Emily's words. He looked at Caleb, then back at her. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "I'll take your word for it," he said, "but I still need you to come with me." The sheriff's orders. Caleb knew this was it, the moment where everything could change. His past had caught up with him, but it didn't have to define him. Not anymore. He turned to Emily, and she gave him a small but reassuring smile. With her by his side, Caleb felt like he could face anything. "All right," Caleb said, his voice steady. "I'll go with you. But I'll do it on my terms." The sheriff's man nodded, motioning for his companion to dismount. "We'll ride to Willow Creek. It'll be a few hours. We'll make sure you get there without any trouble." Caleb turned to Emily one last time before he mounted his horse. "Stay here," he said softly. "I'll be back soon." Emily's eyes met his, and for a brief moment Caleb saw something there that made his heart ache. Love. Trust. A promise. "I'll be right here, Caleb," she said, her voice calm and filled with certainty. "I believe in you." The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Caleb didn't feel alone. He had a future now. A future with Emily. And whatever happened next, he knew he wouldn't face it by himself. As they rode toward Willow Creek, Caleb thought about the life he had left behind. The life he had chosen to leave behind. He wasn't an outlaw anymore. He was something better. He was a man with a second chance, and he was going to take it. The sun was setting as they approached the town, the warm glow of the evening light casting long shadows on the dusty road. Caleb felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever happened next, he had already found something far more precious than he could have ever imagined. Love.
Redemption.
And a life worth living. And as he rode into town, with Emily's promise in his heart, Caleb knew that he was finally free.